a wonderful teaching on the book of Philippians by Sean Emsley. And previous, as you know, I've taught on a number of New Testament letters and books. And part of my thinking in doing this is that we get such rich teaching from Aleph Beta and our own teachers on the Torah and the Torah and the Haftorah. And it's important that we have a balanced sort of service and balanced teaching. So we also want to make sure that we get teaching about from the Brit Hadashah as well. Plus, it's important that we as the Messianic congregation help explain the teaching of the New Testament to our brothers and sisters, our family, and that we make sure that we get everything squared away in that start video, because it looks like I didn't do that before. Oh, there I am. Sorry for that. You might notice something different about me this morning. Those of you who look closely, I'm no longer wearing the collar around my neck that I have had to wear since November 8th after November 9th after the surgery for my accident. And they've declared that my neck must be strong enough to handle it without a collar. So yesterday I took off the collar. It was a thrilling moment for me because it's another step in my improving of my life and my getting better. Anyway, so I want to go over to talk about Titus this morning. Titus is not one of those books or letters of the New Covenant that gets a lot of attention, like Romans and Acts and Hebrews. Titus is one of the smaller letters in the New Covenant, and it almost seems insignificant to many people, although there's a lot of great truths, great teaching in the letter that Paul wrote to Titus. So this morning I want to talk about that and see if we can find some truths from Titus. I know we can, so that's what we're going to do this morning, and for another couple of days after this. So that's what we're going to do. So let's take a look at this, and I want to first mention to you that Titus deals with a lot of. Titus did not write Titus, by the way. Paul wrote Titus to Titus, but it's called Titus, and a lot of people get confused by that. But this letter was dealing with some issues in that congregation, or that group of believers in where this took place is in Crete, and I'm going to show you a picture of Crete shortly. We don't need to show it yet, but we're going to show it in a few minutes. It's like an extension of Greece, if you will. It sticks down into the Mediterranean Sea, south of Greece. And it was one of the many places that the good news of the Messiah needed to get shared. And as you know, in recent months, I've talked to you about the teaching to the Ephesian believers. We've heard about the Philippian believers, and I've talked about some of the teachings from Paul to other areas in that part of the world. But in the letter to Titus, the issues there really transcend many of the of many centuries. The issues in Titus you could find in every Messianic congregation today, I promise you. And you'll hear this as we unpack the book of the letter to Titus. Every congregation that I've known, in the Messianic world especially, wrestles with the issues that are brought up in Titus. But even more so, this has a greater application because there are instructions in Titus that could pertain to any local congregation that you would go to or attend. It deals with policies and procedures because every congregation that I know of goes through changes, goes through organizing, reorganizing, disorganizing, and then reorganizing again. Congregations are very fluid. There's a lot of movement, and so forth and so on. So a congregational life is very, very fluid. It moves. And not only that, leaders change. And and in this section in Titus, there's a discussion about leaders, what leaders of a congregation should be like, and characteristics for those leaders and qualifications for those leaders, whether it's a rabbi or a pastor or even a leader of a Shabbat school or a leader of a subgroup, that like a worship team or a mission program, or a group that provides help to the needy. Every group needs a leader, and leaders have certain requirements according to the letter to Titus. So that's the kind of thing that we're going to look at this morning. And one thing that we're going to get out of this, and especially, is that Titus emphasizes the importance of sound doctrine, sound biblical doctrine or teaching that is to be modeled and taught by trained and qualified leaders. So an essential point of Titus, the letter to Titus, is that it's to teach leaders about leadership, and also it emphasizes the importance of having good leaders in your congregation. So we will always evaluate our leaders according to the teachings in Titus, and also Timothy for that matter, and try to apply those teachings to us as well. Now, I want to go and first let me say this. A lot of material in my message today comes from a friend of mine, Joseph Kolner, who some of you know, who went on our last tour to Israel before the pandemic. We did have a tour plan in the works, but we had to cancel it. And those of you who are on our last tour to Israel, remember Joseph Kolner. He was the rabbi of the congregation that joined us from Florida. And he's a great guy, he's a good teacher. And a lot of this material comes from his writing. But one of the things that he brought out very well was that there's a concept in the writings of the people that wrote about Titus, that Titus is a description of essentially of twins divided in the womb. Now we remember Jacob and Esau were twins divided in the womb, and you remember the trouble they had. Well, some other twins were divided in the womb as well. In fact, let me read to you from Jacob Neusner, who's a prolific and famous Jewish scholar of Christianity. He wrote a book called Judaism in the Beginnings of Christianity, and there he asserts the following: the history of Christianity begins in Israel with the Jewish people and within Judaism. The history of Christianity begins in Judaism. Unfortunately, as I say many times, the church decided to cut off its Jewish roots, and in my opinion has been floundering a little bit ever since those days. Another Jewish writer, Daniel Boyarin, who's very popular these days, states for the first 3 centuries of the believing community, for at least the first 3 centuries of the common lives of Judaism and Christianity, because they were kind of running parallel for a while, in all its forms, they were part of one complex religious family. Now, I want to point that out. Neusner, Boyarin, who's a Jewish scholar, sees all the connections between the Jewish people and the Messianic Jews and the non-Messianic Jews as part of a complex religious family, and that exists to this very day. And we see this even more complex with the addition of non-Jews who become part of this very wonderful and rich and lovely complex Jewish family. Boyarin goes on and says that these were twins in a womb, each contending with the other for identity and precedence, but sharing with each other the same spiritual food. Let me tell you something. There was a lot of competition in the first 3 centuries between the Messianic Jews and the non-Messianic Jews, and a lot of teaching is misunderstood because it sounds like it's Jews against Christians, but it's not. It's Messianic Jews, non-Messianic Jews who had problems with Messianic Jews. And that's material that we see throughout the Gospels, and particularly in the letters, and we're going to see it a little bit here. Another modern scholar, now I'm sharing these teachings of the modern scholars of modern Jewish scholars to understand that this is not some strange concept that I'm bringing forth pertaining to Titus, because you have to understand the background of each letter and the back of the New Testament to really get it. And one of the issues was the situation in the first few centuries of the Messianic world, that there was a lot of conflict and confusion between the Messianic Jews and the non-Messianic Jews. So a lot of stuff that we read needs to be unpacked within that framework. But another author, Shay Cohen, is very popular today, said the essential part of this process, that's the process of separating Christianity from Judaism, was that the church was becoming more and more Gentile and less Jewish. But the separation manifested itself in different ways in each local community where Jews and Christians dwelt together. In some places, the Jews actually expelled the Christians, and in other places, the Christians left on their own accord. So this is not something that should sound terribly unfamiliar to us, because we've seen this struggle in our congregation. Sometimes we're accused of being too Jewish, sometimes not Jewish enough, and we try to find a good balance, because we know that our ministry is to Jewish people and Christian people as well. So we want to remind everybody of that fact. Let me move on. One of the writers of this period, named Jerome Quinn, said that most commentators agree that the Messianic community in Crete, which is where Paul was writing to Titus, Crete. Now, Carrie, if you could put up the picture of Crete on the screen, I want you to get an idea of where Crete actually is. It's not you know where Italy is in the Mediterranean Sea and where Greece is. Well, Crete is sort of an island, I believe, south of Greece, and it stands by itself. I don't know if that picture's up there or not. I can't quite tell. Let's see. Well, we don't have the picture up there yet, but maybe we do. Oh, there we go. Great. Okay, so take a look here. You can see Crete. Thank you for circling that, Carrie. I assume that's Carrie's. Somebody's pointer is. You see where Galatia is over to the right? Remember, I spoke about Galatians several months ago, maybe longer. I'm not exactly sure. And that's really that area where Galatia is, and to the right or east, where you see Antioch and Damascus. That's really where the whole movement to the Gentiles began, because Paul and so forth left Jerusalem, which Carrie's going to find for us down here in a little bit. There's Jerusalem. I didn't know I was going to get this kind of help, but wonderful, Carrie. So remember, everything began in Jerusalem, and then and Paul was sent out to Antioch and to Asia Minor, which is part of Galatia. What's called Galatia, and Asia Minor east of that. And this is where Galatia is where Paul planted a lot of his congregations. You see Ephesus down there. Well, guess what? Ephesus is where the letter to the Ephesians was sent. I mean, not literally, but it was beyond that, but not only to Ephesus, but it went beyond that. And then you see Corinth over there, and Achaia, and then down there is little Crete. I don't know why we got a lane here. Okay. So there's Crete, and I want to talk about this. I'm going to show you another picture next week where we expand the size of that little picture. So now we can take that off the screen. I want everybody to get a sense of where we were geographically. Keep in mind, I want to remind you that the gospel message, which back in the first century included the Torah, was supposed to go out to the known world. And it went first to the Gentile world after leaving Jerusalem and Israel, and the Gentiles did not know what to do with the Torah. So a lot of that discussion you pick up in the writing to Titus here. Another Jewish author said that the well, let's see here. I'm going to go down a little further. One author attests to the fact that in Crete, similar issues existed between believers of the Jewish and Gentile origins. You know, this is nothing new. in our congregation and and all Messianic congregations, it's nothing new that there's dissension and discussion and differences of opinions about this. And I'm glad for that. I don't want to say, well, we have to believe one thing, because we come from different backgrounds and we bring a lot to the table. So I'm thrilled that in our congregation we have non-Jews as well as Jews, and we reach out in a Jewish way to the Jewish community as well as to the Gentile community. So the book of Titus, as well as other extra biblical literature of this era, showed that there was a development of a schism between the twins in the womb, not Jacob and Esau, but the Messianic Jews and the non-Messianic Jews. That was an issue that was happening. Let's go a little further. I want to give you a little bit of background now, a little more historical background. I think I have time. Yeah. In the time of Titus, Crete was a Roman province. As you saw below, Crete was very near Rome, Italy, basically. And the Roman governor was called the proconsul, and he ruled Crete. And he ruled it from a city called Gortna, and we're going to see something more about that next week. But I want you to know that there were many, many, many Jews that lived in this Roman province called Crete. In fact, the Alexandrian philosopher, a famous philosopher from Alexandria, said that the mainlands of Crete were filled with Jewish colonies, and even in and the land of Crete was a sea was full of Jews. So this is in one of the letters that he wrote. So there was distinctly many Jewish people living in Crete. I don't know why. I want to make sure you understand why that's so important. Because you can't understand Titus without knowing that Titus was written by Paul to Titus to deal with issues in Crete, and many of those issues had to do between the Jewish people, which were many, many in Crete, a land full of Jews, as this one author wrote, and yet many Gentiles were becoming part of this movement. So Gortna, I just mentioned that before, and I'll show you a picture of that next week, was the center of Jewish life in Crete, and it was located on the south side of Crete, which you'll see, and Gortna became the Roman provincial capital. The Romans decided this Gortna city will be a good capital, so they made it the capital. But interestingly enough, a professor of New Testament from a Southern Nazarene University said that agreed that the Jewish community of Crete had its primary origins in Alexandria, Egypt. So it's a lot of movement among the Jewish people in these days. But what I found most interesting was that this city of Gortna, which was the Roman proconsul made the provincial capital, attracted Jewish artisans and technicians from Alexandria, Egypt. So what we're learning here is that there were many, many Jews, artisans, artists, sculptors, painters, and such that lived in this capital city of Crete. And that I'm not just telling you that for the heck of it. I'm telling you that because we're going to need to remember that as we continue examining the letter to Titus. Now, just to go back for a second, it's clear that Rav Shaul somehow or another did evangelize Crete, although it's not really clear as to when. It's not mentioned in his missionary journeys, but we do know that Crete had many Jewish and Gentile believers living in it. In fact, I might remind us that in the book of Acts, we read about the fact that on Shavuot, or what's called Pentecost, there was a revival that broke out, and it says thousands and thousands of Jews that had come to Jerusalem to celebrate Pentecost, or in Hebrew, Shavuot, became believers by the work of the Holy Spirit, and many of them returned to their own homes with the gospel. And it was the gospel, but not just only the gospel. I want to point out that these were Jews, so when they brought the gospel back, they brought it back within a Jewish context, so that's all they knew. So many of them went back to Crete as believers, and they brought the good news, the full good news. That's the gospel of the Messiah, as well as the Torah as well, brought back to Crete. So a lot was going on here in these days. I can remind you that in Acts 2, we learned that 3,000 responded to Kepha's message right away, and we know that many more did follow and believe. So the good news that God had put into place began to spread at Pentecost or Shavuot, and we read about that in Acts 2 and around in Acts 2 through and also Acts the later part of Acts 2, the beginning part and later part. So you can read about the spread of the gospel right there, and it began with the Jewish people once again in Jerusalem on Shavuot, on Pentecost. Now, this is something you probably don't know, because I didn't know it. The Orthodox Church in America accepts the tradition that Titus was actually present at Shavuot. In fact, they write, at Jerusalem, Saint Titus, that's what they call him, Saint Titus saw the Lord. He heard his preaching and he believed in him. He witnessed the suffering and death of the Savior on the cross, the glorious resurrection and ascension to heaven. On the day of Pentecost, the future apostle, see the Orthodox Church of America referred to Titus as an apostle. I'll get back to that in a minute. But they said the future apostle heard how the 12 apostles, after the descent of the Holy Spirit, spoke in various languages, among which was the Cretan language, Acts 2:11. So we know that there were people who spoke the Cretan language there at that particular event. And you know that when they went back to Crete, which is where they were living, they brought the whole counsel of God. So it apparently is that Shaul and Titus both spent some time in Crete, and there was some sort of a fledgling community of believers, probably that began with this Pentecost revival and Shavuot, and they were beginning to develop into a legitimate community, which is exactly why Paul, wrote the letter to Titus to organize and strengthen the existing Messianic community. So just by background, I want you to understand that this is a very important province in the Roman Empire, because if you just picture it, where it was situated compared to Israel and Asia Minor and Italy and Greece, it was going to definitely be contacted by, if you were a military leader, you would start your campaign maybe in Jerusalem and spread it out, and it spread out to Crete. And now we're going to learn in the next section about what really was going on and what was the message to the people who were living in Crete at that time. Remember, Paul was the main apostle to the Gentiles, but his raison d'etre was to reach his own people, the Jewish people, with the gospel. Paul's missionary strategy was always to go to the Jewish people first. So when he scoped out the Mediterranean area, he went to Crete because there were many, many Jews that lived in Crete. Some people believe that Crete was dominated by Jewish people and that there were many Gentiles that lived there anyway. And many of these Gentiles became part of this Messianic community that Paul instructed Titus to set up. So essentially, that's what we're going to start seeing as we go on. Remember, Titus and 1st and 2nd Timothy were considered part of the pastoral epistles. Pastoral epistles meaning that these were letters. Epistle means letter, that Paul wrote to some of his followers to give them instructions in daily conduct. In many respects, what Paul was doing was giving instructions to his followers on how to have let's call it a messianic halakha. Halakha means the way to walk. The Torah is halakha, and the traditions are halakha, the ways of behavior. And so Paul was beginning to instruct his followers to have this sort of behavior that they needed to have through Titus. So Paul is writing to Titus and telling him to instruct these people. So I want to just tackle a verse to begin with. I can't get into too much more this morning, but the writer, when we see the book of Titus, when you open your Bibles and look at the book of Titus, it says that it was written by Shaul. Now, nobody has really argued that point. Occasionally somebody says, oh, no, it wasn't really Shaul. Paul was somebody else. But most everybody, it's undisputed that the author of Titus, the letter to Titus, was written by Rav Shaul. And I just accept that as truth. I don't see any reason to argue about that. And that he wrote this to Titus around 63 of the Common Era. Titus, by the way, is mentioned 15 times in the New Covenant, and it first appears in Corinthians chapter 2, verse 13. Chronologically, the first mention of Titus occurs in Galatians 2, 1 through 3. And you might remember that when I taught Galatians last year, I mentioned that the first section, we read the letter, and it mentions Titus there in the first section of Galatians. I'm not going to read it to you again. We don't have to do that. Titus was considered to be a disciple, and I want to get into this a little bit. A disciple or a Talmid of Shaul. Means he traveled with him. A disciple in those days meant you pretty much attached yourself to your rabbi and you traveled with him. And it may be that Titus was born in Corinth, but somehow or another he found his way to be with Paul because he was a disciple of Paul. Shaul writes to the epistle to Titus to remind him that he left Crete so that that is Titus, could oversee and help reorganize the Messianic synagogue that was already being formed in Crete. There were divisions, there were splits, there were problems, people were confused. Should they be very Jewish, like the party of the circumcision argued, or should they be kind of not too Jewish at all? Or what do we do with these Gentiles that are starting to become part of the community? Where do they fit? So these were all issues that were swirling around. These are new believers. Remember, first century, they didn't have any background. They didn't have any Bible study materials. They didn't even have a Bible except the Tanakh. So they were very confused as to what to do. And Paul, with the wisdom that he had, sent Titus to oversee the community in Crete. And I'm going to talk to you more about that next week, because Titus was not just one of Paul's converts. He was very special. In fact, you'll learn it. We'll pick up that early next week when I continue teaching the letter to Titus. And let's keep looking to see what we can learn for our congregation, the manual, and beyond that, from the letter that Rav Shaul wrote to his special son in the Lord, Titus. We'll pick up on that next week. See you later at 1 o'clock to discuss some other stuff.
Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol, l'teit gedula li'yotze bereshit, shelo asanu kigoye haratzot, v'lo samanu k'mishpachot hadama, shelo sam chelkenu kohem, v'goraleinu v'chol hamolam, v'anachnu korim, Umishtachavim umodim lifnei melech malchei hamlachim hakadosh Baruch Hu. It is incumbent upon us to praise the Master of all, to exalt the Creator of the world, for he has made us distinct